Good evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome. For those of you who are joining us for your very first time tonight at the Coastal Lecture Series, my name is Zach Judd. I'm the Director of Education at Florida Oceanographic Society, and I'm really excited to welcome all of you here tonight to our incredible lecture. I have to say, I haven't counted all of you yet, but I think this is probably our biggest in-person turnout at the Blake Library so far. And that said, we've had some amazing turnouts so far this year. Last week, we had about 120 people here at the Blake and another 200 watching on Zoom. So thank you to everybody both here in person and my Zoom audience watching from home. We're really appreciative of you coming out week after week, especially tonight on Valentine's Day. I'm flattered that you're here tonight to hang out with our speaker rather than going out on a fancy Valentine's date. Hopefully we don't let you down. I think you'll have a nice time. Out of curiosity, how many of you are with us for your very first lecture tonight? Awesome. Every week we have brand new people in the audience, and that gives me an opportunity to tell all of you a little bit more about this lecture series. We still have 4 more fantastic lectures on the schedule after tonight. So we run this series all the way through March 14th this year. But we also have recordings of all of our previous lectures on our website. For everybody who just raised your hand, you've missed some amazing presentations over the last few weeks. If you'd like to see them, just visit our website and you can watch them from the comfort of your own home. Lake Okeechobee discharges are still happening. They're not in the news, nobody's talking about them, but right this minute we are getting about 300 million gallons a day dumping from the lake into our estuary. Guys, 1 billion gallons every 3 days pouring out of the lake, and there's no end in sight. I say that only because I know sometimes when these stories slip out of the news cycle, they slip out of your minds as well. I don't want that to happen. So please visit our advocacy page on our website, and you can learn more about what Florida Oceanographic is saying about these discharges as well as other environmental issues. If you have a smartphone, I think most of you do, on the back table I have a QR code. You literally just aim your phone at that QR code, and it'll take you right to our advocacy website where you can learn more about what's happening. All right, enough of me talking. I know what you guys are here for. Tonight's special guest speaker, John Nelson, is best known as the voice of the Audubon Moment, a popular weekly radio program that airs on WQCS. A passionate photographer and documentarian, John spent nearly 4 years researching and producing a documentary film called America's Amazon, the story of the St. Lucie River. John explored documents, films, audio tracks, historical images, and technical drawings to try to unravel the twisting and turning history of our beautiful river. Tonight, John will tell us more about his journey to more fully understand the story of the St. Lucie. It's my pleasure to introduce John Nelson.
Thank you all very much. I can't believe how many people are here. Now, I hope you're not disappointed that I don't have ruggedly handsome good looks. Yeah, I know, I don't. But I have a hunch that this guy does. Before I start talking about the St. Lucie River, I just thought I'd introduce you to my family. This guy, needless to say, doesn't look like he's a Harvard graduate, does it? But that's actually one of my relatives from the 1920s. My family, actually, my ancestors grew up in the Idaho wilderness. And if you know anything about the Idaho wilderness, there's not a whole lot of need for a pickup truck, although he had one. Back in the 1920s, my father, who is pictured on the far right-hand side there, grew up in a one-room log cabin where he was born. The family was very avid hunters and fishermen because they were subsistence homesteaders, if you will. My grandfather ran a gold mine that would give them a little bit of cash, but if they wanted to eat, they had to go out and get it. And that's the way they lived in the Idaho wilderness. And that's the way that my ancestors spoke to me when I was a kid, telling the stories about the places where they would go in the Idaho wilderness. They would go fishing in lakes that to this day are named after some of my relatives in the McCall, Idaho area up in the mountains there. My grandfather was a guide, believe it or not, in the 1920s. We talk about ecotourism today. You know, he would take some of the industrial elites that would want to go up into the Idaho wilderness, and he would operate a pack train and take them into some of these mountain lakes where, you know, incredible cutthroat trout and rainbow trout that were huge would be for fishing expeditions. When I was in 1972, my father was a pastor, by the way. He served in World War II as a radio operator on a PBM patrol bomber, which was based right here in Florida. And he went to college on the GI Bill, became a pastor. And in 1972, the church that he was with, called him up, the superintendent called him up one day and said, "Oh, by the way, Al, we'd like to move you." Well, that wasn't any big deal because we got moved around a lot. But this time he said, "We'd like to move you to a little country called Rwanda in Central Africa." Oh. Yeah. I was 16 years old. My dad told me what we were going to do, and I said, "Where is the next plane? Let's go." I was so sick and tired of Seattle. I had gotten myself into a lot of trouble, had a police record, and I did actually. And there was only one problem. If I was going to go to Central Africa, to Rwanda, they wanted a police report that said that I didn't have a police record. And my parents went down to the Seattle Police Department and told them what was going on, and they hemmed and hawed for a little while, and I wasn't privy to the conversation, but what I was told was that this is a golden opportunity to get rid of this jerk. Let's get him out of the country. So I went to high school at a place called Rift Valley Academy in Kajabi, Kenya. I graduated in 1974, and in 2006, I went back to RVA, and on the last day of our high school class reunion, it was the 100th anniversary of the founding of our school, and on the last day, I went to Lake Nakuru National Park, which is about 30 clicks away from our school, and while I was there, it suddenly dawned on me that I knew more about the ecology of East Africa than what I knew was in my own backyard. And I was ashamed of that. I couldn't believe that I cared so little about what was going on in Florida. And so I started to get an education in Florida. I started classes to become a Florida master naturalist. I joined Audubon. I became an avid birder. I've always been a photographer. Even my first camera was given to me when I was about 8 years old. And in fact, I got myself very active in the environmental movement. In 2013, my wife and I went to, anybody know where that is? Alaska, Mount Denali. We went all through Alaska, from southeast Alaska up almost to Fairbanks. And on that very day, when I took that picture, when I got back to our hotel room, I turned on the TV in 2013, and I heard about the devastating algae blooms that were taking place in Florida. And it made me physically sick. We had spent 2 weeks in Alaska going through just unbelievable beauty, incredible wildlife, incredible natural scenery, incredible resources that Alaskans were making billions of dollars with every year, but they were doing it in a sustainable, responsible fashion. And some of the people that were traveling with us the next day, they heard the report too, and they said, "John, how in the world could you Floridians be so blankety-blank stupid?" And I didn't have an answer for them. I really didn't. And so, to me, that was the beginning of my research project. I really didn't get serious about it until a year or two later, but it was the beginning of my research to find out what was going on with the St. Lucie River. Unfortunately, today marks the 5th anniversary of the shootings at Margaret Stoneman Douglas School. But she was an incredible environmentalist. And one of her sayings, I just love this, and this was something that stuck with me for a long time. It says, "It's a race between man's intelligence and his stupidity. I don't know which will win." And that is what she was saying about whether or not we're going to be able to save our environment. She had many other sayings as well, one of which, and I'm only paraphrasing here, but she also said something to the effect of, during your journey, you're going to have all kinds of opposition. You're going to have people telling you you're crazy, you can't do it, and blah, 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 blah. But don't let all those other environmentalists get in your way. And she was not a professional environmentalist. She came to Florida, to Miami, to work at her father's newspaper, which eventually became the Miami Herald, and she was the women's gossip columnist. But she started, and this was in the early 1900s, and she got to the point where she saw a bunch of these women were trying to do something about bird slaughters that were going on out in the Everglades. And one thing led to another. And that's how she got started in the environmental movement. You don't have to be a professional environmentalist to take care of the environment, and to be concerned about the environment and to do something about the environment. So if you don't learn anything else about this presentation tonight, don't let the blankety-blank environmentalist stand in your way. That's my Margaret Stoneman Douglas quote for the day. Now, how did I go about doing this film? And by the way, just as a show of hands, how many 4 years ago saw the film at the Lyric Theater? Anybody? All right, this is great. That means I can say anything I want. No, just kidding. Just kidding. We're actually talking about maybe having another showing of it here as a fundraiser, and we might do that fairly soon. But how do you go about researching something that, I chose about 125 years ago as my starting point. And fortunately, in today's day and age, researching a project like this is ridiculously easy, but very time-consuming. These are just some of the resources that I use. The U.S. Library of Congress, the National Archives, Florida Photographic Collection is an excellent online, and all of these are online resources, by the way. University collections, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Hey, if you are thinking about damming up a lake and building some locks, just talk to me. I got the plans. I really do. I really do. All the plans for the Hoover Dike and for all their locks and water retainment structures were online, and I have a lot of those plans. I don't know what I'm ever going to do with them, but I've got them. I would follow what we call internet threads into areas that I would never dream of going into. And some of my research took me as far away as the California historical records and even Seattle City Light, believe it or not. The protagonist in my film, Ernie Lyons, his parents actually took them to live in Seattle for a while. And I tried to find out what was going on out there and why he was in Seattle. The Palm Beach Post, the Stewart News, Elliott Museum was instrumental, and this wonderful lady right here that hopefully most of you know of, Sandra Thurlow, she was just a wonderful guiding light in helping me. And then, as I said, internet threads as well. So I spent 3 years as a sleuth detective. Not full-time, because I have to work as well. I own a mortgage brokerage business, of all things, and I help credit unions do mortgages throughout the state of Florida. But in my spare time, I would go in and start doing all this research. At the same time, by the way, I was also a student at Indian River State College, and I was getting an associate's degree in digital media technology. And it came to mind that, hey, I could do this project as my undergraduate work, if you will, for my degree, and that's exactly what I did. So I wrote the scripts and had the scripts approved by staff and so on and so forth. And then lastly, with 90% of my film complete, I saw that there was an opportunity to take a master class with a gentleman by the name of Ken Burns. Anybody know who Ken Burns is? Yeah, there we go. And I thought, well, if I really screwed up, Ken Burns is going to be able to tell me, and I won't be embarrassed because he won't be there in person. So I took his class, and he goes through, and over the course of I think it was 12 sessions, I'm going through all these different things. I'm going check, 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 check. Yeah, that sounds good. And then the last thing he said was, oh, and by the way, for every hour that you see in my documentaries, I have about 40 hours worth of research material that I can select from. And I'm thinking, I didn't do that. I only had 20 hours worth of research material that I could select from, but I thought, that's probably close enough. So that's how we get started in something like that. The story changed several times. I wrote at least 3 complete script overs to be able to recapture what I thought the flavor of the moment was during these times. I was fortunate enough that because I came to Florida as a non-native, I moved from Seattle in 1990, I really didn't know what the history of the St. Lucie River was. And so on the very first day that I started doing research, the Elliott Museum allowed me to go into the research library, and the research librarian pulled out a diary from a lady by the name of Margaret Ann Peck Johnson. And let me just read this to you. While living in Florida, the beautiful land of flowers, we decided to buy a nice large sailboat and take a pleasure trip down the most beautiful river next to the Hudson in beautiful and grandeur. Now that says a lot for the Hudson, doesn't it? But remember when this was. This was the Indian, and we were living in the lovely town of Cocoa. The scenery in and around this was magnificent. We had been living in this little town several months when we decided to take this trip down the Indian River to Jupiter Inlet, thence up the St. Lucie River to White City, a new town just being built at the time, just out in the piney woods orb the banks of this river. The scenery in and around White City was the most beautiful of all the places we were ever at while in Florida. January 1894. Once again, I sat there and I said to myself, what in the world happened? You know, I kept on reading her diary. It was 32 pages long of just that trip. At one point in time, she talked about how the boys went off, the men went off to do some hunting for some venison, and her and her, I think it was her daughter, were on the boat, and they just had a fishing pole out, and lo and behold, they caught a 16-pound wide-mouthed bass. I don't know what the record wide-mouthed bass is, but that's a big one. A few years later, excuse me, in 1886, there's a gentleman that comes into the play, and I thought that Homer was going to be my protagonist, my main character, but I quickly realized that he was kind of a loser, to be perfectly honest with you. And you'll read this. Had an earthquake here yesterday. 3 cans of turtle soup exploded. It seemed good to have something to eat again. Mother says she intends to live well if the fleas, snakes, roaches, toads, lizards, spiders, sand spurs, ticks, scorpions, wasps, hornets, flies, bats, owls, and hard beds do make her get up at sunrise. I would certainly think so. They say pitch pine boards are healthy to sleep on. Try one. Now that sounds a little ridiculous, but any guess as to who he was writing this letter to? His fiancée, who, needless to say, was not in Florida. Somewhere up in the Northeast, I believe it was up in Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken. Needless to say, you know, love got the better of Homer, and he didn't last too long. He was able to lend his name to our development, but shortly after he wrote that letter, you know, he said goodbye to Florida and never came back again. You know, like I said, his love interests were firmly rooted outside the state, and there's no way that he was going to get his fiancée down into conditions like this. But that's the way people lived here. You know, and there's incredible historical records and historical documents showing how this area developed. You have to remember that during this time, you know, this area was an incredible wild area, even more wild than the Wild West. Right after right after the Civil War, the federal government finally came down and surveyed all this area. And by surveying the area, that allowed homesteaders to finally come in and start settling this area. But you would say to yourself, why would they? I mean, with all the crocodiles and alligators, and you know, crocodiles, yes, American crocodiles, alligators, yellow fever, et cetera, why would anybody want to live in this area? It says it's hard to believe that the beauty which you see today is only a shadow of what the river must have looked like in the late 1800s. The beauty of the river was without dispute, but its wild nature was even more wild than we could ever possibly imagine. And it took an awfully hard settler to be able to live in these kind of conditions. And more than just a few died trying, let me tell you. Even the wildlife that we see on the river now is just a mere shadow of what it was back in those days. Here's a pileated woodpecker, which is one of my favorite birds. And, you know, we see them occasionally in this area. They're fairly common. But again, you know, we're just looking at a mere pittance of the wildlife, both, you know, mammals and birds and fish. I mean, there used to be a huge scallop industry in this area. We don't have that anymore because we absolutely, totally abused it and got rid of and fished it out of existence. Yeah, we have gators, but at one point in time, gators were on an endangered species list. And in the early 1970s, we had to take drastic measures to get gators to come back. Now they're all over the place, including some of our swimming pools, come May and June during gator mating season. And we have exotic birds like this American oyster catcher. But again, the numbers are so small. At one point in time, shortly before World War II, there were only 15 nesting pairs of roseate spoonbills in the state of Florida because people were killing them and taking the wings and turning them into women's fans. We had no sense, no sense of ecological responsibility, of conservation. And in fact, in the turn of the 1900s, there were approximately 2.4 million wading birds in Florida. But because of the plume trade that was finally stopped in about the 1910s, 1920s, the population was reduced from 2.4 million to 100,000. Because they thought that those plumes would be really nice in ladies' hats. No offense, women, but that's the way it was. Today, our population of wading birds has increased up to 200,000. We have a long ways to go. Here's a tricolored heron, one of my favorite birds, over on the west coast of Florida. And there is a black-bellied plover in summer plumage. That's why it doesn't have a black belly. And finally, this is a great one. This is on Lake Okeechobee. This is the least bittern, the smallest of the heron family. And again, these are just some of the birds that we still have, but their numbers are so incredibly low compared to what they were that it's shocking what we've done to our environment, not just St. Lucie River, but the entire state of Florida. The national symbol for Audubon is the great egret. This was taken at Wakota-Hatchie, and he was looking for love. He was. He figured, I can strut my stuff, and he was doing his best peacock imitation. And I don't know if he was successful, but he held that pose for me for over 30 minutes. And it was a great opportunity. And finally, one of our birds that we do have a lot of today that has made a tremendous comeback, but in the 60s and early 70s almost was exterminated in this area, the osprey. Because of DDT and the thinning of eggshells, we almost lost this species along with eagles, and most people may not know it, but also with brown pelicans. Now, brown pelicans don't sit on their nest, they stand on their eggs. And the weight of their bodies would crush the eggs until we eliminated DDT in the environment. But this is an osprey at the, just a little bit west of the Vero Beach area, carrying a fish that was so large he could hardly keep the thing in the air. All right, so that's our environment then and now. How did we become an ecotourism county? You may not realize it, but sooner or later we go over there and we celebrate the Pineapple Festival in Jensen Beach, and we're thinking that that's how our area really made it big. But that's really not the case. The pineapple industry had a major collapse because of two different reasons I discovered. One, of course, was the freezes that took place shortly after the turn of the 1900s. But the other one was the Flagler Railroad. When the Flagler Railroad came into our area, Mr. Flagler took that railroad all the way to Key West. And what he did is he gave favorable transportation routes and fees to the pineapple growers in Cuba. And by doing that, he undercut the businesses here in this area, and our pineapple growers didn't have a competitive means of being able to ship their product to market, and the market collapsed. So about that same time, there was a gentleman that built one of the first hotels in the area, and his name was John Danforth. John Danforth was a guy from Maine, and he was quite a go-getter. He was a hustler. He decided in Maine that if they have all these industrial, wealthy, elite people in the Northeast that are dying to get out into the woods, the North Woods of Maine, he would build a whole bunch of hunting lodges and camps that would take care of their every needs. He'd give them personal guides, and he made a fortune. He saw that ecotourism, if you will, in the form of hunting and fishing lodges was quite the deal. And when he heard about Florida, and at that point in time, by the way, the Treasure Coast of Florida was being called the America's Amazon, or the Jungle River. And that's how we got the name for the title for our film, because people were saying, hey, you don't have to go to South America. All you have to do is go down to the Treasure Coast of Florida. Man, they've got it all. You know, you want gators? They got gators so big you don't have a tape measure big enough to measure them. You know, you want fish? They got tarpon that are so huge you can't pick them up. And you know something? They weren't lying either. You know, and John Danforth went down there to see that, and he was so convinced that he spent about $22,000 of his own money, and in that day, $22,000 was a lot of money. And he built himself a boat with a shallow draft, brought it, he personally piloted the boat down to the Treasure Coast, and he set up shop. And that was the beginning of what we now know as ecotourism here in the Treasure Coast. When the pineapple industry collapsed, our city and our counties kept on growing. And it wasn't because they replaced pineapple with another crop. It was because of ecotourism. You know, we had a great thing going for us, and yet we abused it to the point where it eventually you would think that it would have collapsed, but fortunately it hasn't. But it's a mere shell of what it used to be. You can see there's a sawfish that was pulled up, and they talked, and in some of these flyers that you see here, you know, a mile of pleasure, sport and recreation on the Jensen Bridge. Quite the deal. There's a tarpon from the St. Lucie River. Weight, I can't quite read that, but length is over 7 feet, I think is what that says. You can see on the upper left, that's the pineapple industry that was going on up there, but there's a single net catch on one of the beaches along the Indian River. So our resources were incredible. We just had amazing resources. And yet, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, up until about 1902 or 1904, we had something that was really causing a major problem in our area, and that was yellow fever and malaria. And we didn't understand what was going on, what the cause of yellow fever and malaria was. And again, you know, my research through all these different internet sites, especially the Florida Photographic Collection, I uncovered that the state of Florida was actually giving yellow fever immunity cards. They figured that if you had yellow fever, you can't catch it again. You know, and so they would give you these immunity cards. Life insurance companies would do the same thing. And as long as you carried that, you could travel. Travel outside of Florida was a major problem during this time. Yellow fever was the scourge of all up and down the East Coast. You know, we don't think of yellow fever and malaria as being a problem anymore, but people were dying of yellow fever and malaria up in New York and in Pennsylvania and all up and down the eastern seaboard because they didn't understand what it was. People that would try to get off of a train that had come from Florida, sometimes they were physically at gunpoint forced to get back on the train and go back to Florida because people didn't want them carrying yellow fever or malaria to their towns and their states. Again, they didn't really understand what was going on until finally a gentleman by the name of Dr. Walter Reed confirmed some of the information and the research findings of a Dr. Carlos Finley, who was working in Cuba at the time. And in 1901, you know, he published this research that it wasn't a contagious disease. It was simply something that you got from malaria bites. He died in 1902, by the way, of a ruptured appendix, but his research was published. And when that research was published, then all of a sudden, everything went ape crazy. And again, these photographs are so easy for you to obtain by going into some of those research sites that I told you about. It takes a lot of time to get them. You have to be creative in how you're searching for them, but it can be done. You know, and again, I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these photographs that I was able to glean from these different research sites. And here we are, clearing out some of the swampy areas and building a mosquito control ditch so that they could get mosquitoes out of their area. Land transportation during this time was a little rough. Any guess on what that road is? A1A, yeah. Yeah, little tough, huh? It says here, water transportation was far more preferable to land transportation. The only way to ship goods was to really, literally ship the goods. But as I said, Flagler's Railroad finally changed all that, and we eventually got out of coastal freighters, coastal shipping freighters. But one of the things that was brought about in those early 1900 area, about 1915, what is now the Stewart Chamber of Commerce, I discovered, became a major endorser and pusher of an idea of creating a commercial canal that would connect the Stewart area with Fort Myers. And they thought, man, if we could just do that, we could have all of our produce shipped over to the West Coast where there's a whole nother market, and they could do the same, and it would just be a huge commercial success. And you'll see here that their proposal for the canal actually started in Port Salerno, Manatee Pocket. And that's where the St. Lucie Canal was supposed to originally be started at. And then it would go across to Port Mayaca, where the terminus on Lake Okeechobee would be. At the last minute, that was changed, and it was moved over to the South Fork of the St. Lucie River. A unfortunate disaster. At the same time, as you saw, we were clearing the swamps, and we were turning swampland into farmland. And by so doing, we were also increasing the watershed size of the St. Lucie River. You can see in green what the original watershed size of the St. Lucie River was, especially the North Fork. But by 1960, it had increased by about 300%. Again, all these records are available to you online. You don't have to take my word for it. You can document everything that I'm saying here tonight if you so choose. It's going to take you a while, but you can do that. But by so doing, we increased the drainage that was going into the St. Lucie River. And when you start having all this agricultural farming that goes in there, and all the fertilization that's going in there, and all the fertilization runoff, that alone, don't even mention the Lake Okeechobee, but that alone is causing problems for the St. Lucie River. And now, to add on top of that, now you urbanize that entire area, and you can see what kind of problems we're having with the St. Lucie River to this very day. Construction began in 1921 on the St. Lucie Canal and the lock system. It says minor modifications brought the locks to St. Lucie and not the Manatee Pocket. This is one of the aerial photographs, one of the few aerial photographs of construction of the St. Lucie Canal. The original canal was only about 4 feet deep because they figured that's all they needed for barge traffic. They weren't looking for flood control. They were just looking for barge traffic, and 4 feet would be more than enough, and it would also, by having it relatively shallow, it would decrease the cost of the construction. Here's one of the dredges that was used on the St. Lucie project. And here is lock number 1 at the St. Lucie locks. Many of us, I'm sure all of us, if you haven't been out there, you need to go out there. You'll see that there is one lock, and only one, but there is an area of grass where it looks like there may have been a second lock. And in fact, there was. The original St. Lucie locks had 2 different locks to it. Lock number 2 not only was in existence, but believe it or not, it actually had a small hydroelectric generator that was built into it, so that when they flushed water out of the system, or they were letting water over the spillways, they could create electricity with that. I never thought that we would have anything like that in Florida, but that was them. This lock has been filled in. It's all grass now. It's no longer used, but this is one of the first boats heading to Port Mayaca, from the St. Lucie locks. And there's lock number 1, and there's lock number 1 again, a few years later, if you will. There's Port Mayaca, you're going out into Lake Okeechobee, and again, that has changed dramatically as to what is going on in our present day. But hey, everybody thought this was a great success. But there was one gentleman that thought otherwise, and that was Ernie Lyons. And he realized that something was going to happen. In 1928, we had a huge hurricane. In fact, there was the 1926 hurricane in Miami, and then there was the 1928 hurricane that hit the Palm Beaches, Lake Okeechobee, and Belle Glade area, the city of Okeechobee itself. And the 1928 hurricane was absolutely devastating. Now, granted, they didn't have great weather forecasters back then, but they honestly didn't think that the hurricane was going to hit this area. And at the very last second, they realized that they were wrong, and by that time, there was no time to prepare for it. The major thing, though, was that the Everglades agricultural region, which had been created in the late 1800s, which was immediately south of Lake Okeechobee, was being protected by a 5-foot-tall dike. Now, 5 feet, and you're going to protect that didn't happen, let me tell you. The devastation was so bad, and this is in the Belgrade area, the flooding was horrible. The death toll was horrific. If you've ever been on the Canner Highway going out towards Lake Okeechobee, on the left-hand side, just a few miles before you get to Port Mayaca, there is a cemetery out there. And if you go into that cemetery, you'll see a memorial to the 1,600 people who died in the hurricane just in this area. They believe the death toll exceeds 3,000. There's another large mass grave in the Palm Beach area. But the death toll was horrific. The devastation was horrific. And here you can see in the lower right a body of corpses that are all laid out waiting to be picked up. They had no idea who they were. Most of the dead, unfortunately, were either Caribbean or workers or black workers that had no identification papers with them. They had no kin, and so they simply dug a mass grave, threw them in as fast as they could for public health, and that was that. But in 1928, because of that, now all of a sudden we have a reason for not a 5-foot dike, which was easily overtopped, but a 30-foot dike around the entire lake. And that's where we start looking at construction in 1931. And it took from 1931 until the early 1960s for the Hoover Dike system to be fully complete. And nobody ever thought that it would take that long. And again, in my research, it's just amazing how much you can find through the Army Corps of Engineers and through the National Archives, especially the National Archives. The Army Corps of Engineers has a few things, but most of their records have been turned over to the National Archives. And again, as I was saying earlier, if you need to build a lock, talk to me, I got the plans. If you need to build a spillway, talk to me, I got the plans. And you can get them too, they're free, absolutely. So, like I said, a 5-foot earthen levee had been built around the southern edge, around Belglade, Pahokee, Clewiston area. But that was just totally wiped out, and that whole area was flooded with massive loss of life. So they figured a 30-foot dike would accommodate future storm surges, and away they went. The canal, again, it had been started in 21. It was deep into in 1928. And now suddenly the St. Lucie Canal, which was built for commerce, became a flood control project. And this is where the St. Lucie River really started to see problems. When you deepen the canal from 4 feet to 8 feet, 12 feet, so you can have, as Zach was saying, right now we're having, 300 million gallons of water a day. At one point in time back in the last major storm, algae bloom, we were having as much as 1 billion gallons of water going over the St. Lucie spillway every day. That's how much water can be accommodated by this canal when they widened it and dredged it. So it's amazing what this can do to absolutely, totally destroy our environment. But nobody was ever thinking of that at that time. The idea of an environmentalist, I don't even think they had a word for it. All they could think about was public safety, and understandably so, and commerce. And, when I get up here and I'm on my golden throne and preaching about all this wonderful stuff, don't get me wrong, I totally understand where these people are coming from. When you just had a loss of life of over 3,000 souls, what are you going to do about it? What are politicians going to do about it? They didn't understand the environment like we do today. And all they could think about is, we have to fight the environment. The environment is our enemy. We have the ability to make this right. After all, 2 weeks ago, by the way, I was in Cologne, Panama, the eastern terminus for the Panama Canal. And their mindset back in those days was, we can do it. You know, if there's something wrong with the environment, we can fix it. If we have water problems, we can control it. You know, during this whole period of time in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, especially the 20s and 30s, you know, as reclamation projects to keep guys working during the Great Depression, they were building dams like there was no tomorrow. There was the Tennessee Valley Authority. There was the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State. There was the Hoover Dam in Colorado. You know, project after project after project. And they all had a common theme: control the flow of water. That's all they could think about, because water was something that could absolutely devastate a community through flooding. And so this project was no different. It was a public safety project every bit as much as it was a commerce project, but we couldn't see beyond our nose as to what was going to happen to our environment. And there you have it. Just, you know, millions and millions and millions of polluted water coming into the St. Lucie River every single day. And right now, we really don't have a good way of stopping it. You know, their project was so effective that even after we realized what the problem was, you know, it's taking us decades to put a finger on it of how we can correct what we spent decades building. We know the problem, and we know the answers, but it just takes so long to be able to fix those problems. And you know, one of the problems that even exacerbated the issue, this is the Kissimmee River. And the Kissimmee River used to have a very wide floodplain. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, they channelized the river so the river water would just flow right straight into Lake Okeechobee. And when it did that, all the sediment and all the pollutants from all the farmers came right into the lake, and that's just exacerbated our problem as well. Here you can see, I'm not going to even try to point out to it, but you can pretty much see where the Everglades is today, and yet the Everglades is only, in that photograph, is only about half the size of what it used to be, because the Everglades agricultural region, as you can see, wraps around the southern part of Lake Okeechobee, and we just don't have the water flow in the lake that we used to have. Instead, it goes west to the Caloosahatchee, and it goes east to the St. Lucie River. And that creates massive problems. And then on top of that, we have the urbanization that has taken place, you know, with Martin and St. Lucie County, and all of those septic tanks and all of the farm runoff that goes into this area. And again, it's just a massive problem that we have, and we beg for clean water, and yet we are the problem, and we have to fix it. In addition to all that, here's the North Fork of the St. Lucie River being, you know, again, just urban population like you can't believe. But if you take a look at the river channel here, the North Fork of the St. Lucie River, you can see there's all kinds of winding bends in the river. Those are called oxbows. But you can also see channels that are just cut right through it. And that was done in the 1960s as well. We channelized the North Fork of the St. Lucie River, thinking that that would help in drainage. And it did. But it also brought that much more pollution, you know, down into the river from all the agricultural and urban farm runoff that has been devastating. So, you know, we've had the endless summer of 2013, where we had massive algae blooms. In 2016, we had a problem that was so bad that our realtors gave us a new term, a new piece of verbiage in our lexicon called sewer front property. Remember that? Sewer front property was waterfront property that was so badly polluted that they couldn't sell it, because you would go outside to take a look at the river, and the stench and the green slime in the water was so bad that who on earth would want to live there? It's just an amazing situation. There it is in 1995. You know, not much different. You know, but again, it gives you a really good idea of the channelization of the river there. On a good day, this is what the St. Lucie Spillway looks like, you know, today. On a bad day, that's what the St. Lucie Spillway looks like. And again, when you have that much pollution coming down, you know, through the St. Lucie Canal, the environmental devastation is beyond belief. And again, it's so hard for me, to understand, having grown up in an environment where nature was everything, where the lakes around McCall, Idaho are named after my relatives, where I used to go hunting and fishing as a teenage kid with my dad and my cousins, up into these lakes where nature was just incredibly pristine. And then I go into a situation like this, and it's beyond belief for me to see this kind of garbage. And we should be ashamed of ourselves for allowing this to happen. But I'm not pointing the finger at any one of you, because this all happened before we were on watch. But it's our responsibility to make sure our politicians understand, why this is so bad and why it has to be taken care of. And we have been making positive steps, but it's going to take a long time, unfortunately, to clean up that kind of stuff. Again, historically, water flow all the way from Orlando, all the way down to the tip of the southern tip of Florida, was a carpet, a river of grass, as Margaret Stoneman Douglas used to say. And now it's just a pittance of what it is. And yet, we need to get back to the diagram on the left. So in 125 years, I discovered in my research that, we opened the St. Lucie River in 1892. By the way, that took 3 chances, 3 times to do that. The first time, it failed miserably. The second time, they were almost done with the project, and just as they were getting ready to open up the inlet, a very young, eligible bachelorette decided that she was going to have a party. And she invited all the construction crew from the inlet project. And they abandoned their work. They went to the party, and all their work silted back in. True story, true story. Finally, in 1892, they hired a more professional company to no comment. A more professional company to finish the job, if you will. And in 1892, they finally channelized the St. Lucie River and opened it up. When that happened, you can see here that it changed the St. Lucie River from a freshwater to brackish, which in and of itself wasn't necessarily bad, but it created a major change in the ecology of the river. Killed off massive amounts of wildlife and marine life for profit. That's what we've done in the last 125 years. We've drained the wetlands to prevent disease, created farmland where freshwater marshes once stood. We've channelized our rivers to increase water flows. We've increased the size of the St. Lucie River watershed, as I said, by about 300%. We've diked Lake Okeechobee to prevent flooding. We've created the St. Lucie Canal and the lock system. We've closed off natural water flows to the Everglades. We've allowed the creation of the Everglades agricultural region. We've allowed uncontrolled pollution to drain through the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee rivers. What a great list of accomplishments. We should give ourselves a hand. It's incredible. But today is the day where we can change things. And we have started changing things. The South Florida Water Management District, just before Governor DeSantis came into power, had, behind everybody's back, signed a sweetheart deal with U.S. Sugar that was going to allow them to make sure that not an acre of land was going to be used for a water reservoir that we had been talking about. For those of you who remember, then State Senator Joe Negron had proposed a $60,000, or 60,000 acre rather, water reclamation reservoir. And U.S. Sugar and their buddies were absolutely adamant against that. As one of the things that I did in my research, I went out and I talked to people. And I asked people if I could videotape them for my film. Well, Judy Sanchez, the Director of Communications for U.S. Sugar, she didn't want to be put on film, but she did talk to me. And we had lunch out at Clewiston, and her parting words to me was, U.S. Sugar will never allow 1 acre of the Everglades agricultural area to ever be used for water reclamation. And that is almost a direct quote. So therein lied another source of the problem. But as I also started doing more and more research and talking to more and more people, I had the privilege of speaking to people like, now deceased, unfortunately, oh boy, my mind is going blank now. No, not Maggie. Nathaniel Reed, sorry, thank you very much. Yeah, Nathaniel Pryor Reed. he invited me out to his house, and we had a wonderful 2-hour conversation on film, which I have to this day, by the way, and we occasionally show that. And he really gave me an incredible oversight of what the river was like when he was a kid and what the problems are today. And again, he's another person. He wasn't born an environmentalist. In fact, he was born in privilege. His parents developed Jupiter Island, and he was independently wealthy. He didn't have to do anything to help with the river, but he saw how much the river had changed, and he wanted to do something about it. I spoke with Clyde Butcher, an incredible nature photographer. And again, Clyde Butcher invited me over to his house, and we had spent the afternoon on film talking about all the issues with the river. Many other people as well, I was able to interview for that. But it all gets back to this, our nature and our wildlife. Even today, we consider it to be spectacular, but it's just a thin shell of what it used to be. When I go out as a photographer and I see scenes like this, I'm just absolutely awestruck at the beauty of great blue herons building a nest like this. I'm awestruck at the manatees that come into our channels that unfortunately are now starving to death because we polluted the water so badly. I'm awestruck at all the different things that go on in our natural areas. Never mind that we've lost more than 53% of all of our wetlands in the last 125 years in Florida. But the ones that we have left, we need to keep. And so, it says our wildlife in the air, on the ground, and in the water, they only have one voice. And that's ours. If we don't protect these guys, nobody is going to. Nobody is going to be able to do that. So, as I leave you tonight, the St. Lucie River has gone through some tremendous problems. But we know what the answers are, but we have to gut it out. We have to make sure that we can make sure that people act as a voice for wildlife. And that's what we sometimes do. Some of you might remember this. This was the Buy the Land rally that took place in 2000, I think it was 2018, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 2016, I can't quite remember. Governor Rick Scott for jail. That was interesting. But when we speak up as one voice, we can make things happen. We really can. And so I just hope and pray, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir right now, because you guys all belong to one of the greatest environmental organizations that we have in our state. The Florida Oceanographic Society is incredible, and the director, the leadership of this organization, Mark Perry, has done an amazing job at making sure that you guys are well focused and informed about what's going on. But we need to keep it going. We can't sit back and just watch things happen. So that's the St. Lucie River. Thank you. Now, I know that we have some time. Let's go ahead and turn on the house lights. And I suspect, I don't want to sound too arrogant, but I hope that there's a question or two that somebody might have about this presentation or anything regarding the river. We'll start right here. Yes?
If we were going to write only one letter to a politician, who would you suggest we write it to, and what should we say?
The question was, when we were going to write one letter to a politician, who would I suggest that we should write it to? That's a really good question. Personally, I think that the most powerful form of government is local government. Because local government, and we saw this during some of these algae bloom crises, when people were right next door in the county administration building listening to some of the testimony that was being spoken of during those algae bloom crises. The number of people that were at those meetings was so many that it actually flowed out into a waiting area, and it really put our county commissioners on notice that we were serious. That's how democracy works. When people rise up and people tell their county commissioners or their local politicians or their state senators or whatever that this is a problem, that's finally when the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So I guess that would be my answer. Start local.
And John, if I could just chime in on that real quick, if you guys spin around real quick, this QR code will take you to that advocacy website I mentioned, and that's a really good question, and I think it's issue specific. There are times that you might need to write a letter to a county commissioner. There's times you might need to write a letter to the very top of the pile. On our advocacy website, we'll offer you some guidance. We talk about who is going to be the best set of ears for you to reach out to for a given issue. So definitely check this out. You might find something that's interesting for you.
Excellent. And remember, for those of you who are watching on Zoom, we have the ability to take your questions, and Zach will hopefully pipe up and get some of those here soon. Any other questions? Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Question for you is the water in regards to the algae. And we found out if whether or not Stewart's water is healthy to drink. Question number 2. Did you explain, or can you explain one more time, why the sugarcane companies are not following through on providing some type of relief of the formation of the algae?
Well, okay, question number 1. Well, let me do question number 2 first. The sugarcane companies, the question was, why isn't the sugarcane companies providing some kind of relief? Is that basically what you're saying? Okay, the answer to that is because it costs too much. I mean, they're for profit. I mean, that's all there is to it. And they feel that they've got this God-given right to have this land that was part of the Everglades to begin with. But it's their land, and they're going to do whatever they blankety-blank feel like doing. And excuse me for putting it that way, but that's pretty much what I was told. They don't believe that they're part of the problem. They believe, and for a long time, sugar companies were accused of back pumping water back into the lake, and that may very well have happened. But in fact, the vast majority of the pollution that is coming into the lake these days is coming from urbanization and farms that are in the north side of the lake and not the Everglades agricultural area. I'm not trying to say that they're off the hook, because they're not, because we need part of that land to be able to get water to flow south. We need to have huge stormwater treatment areas where the agricultural EAA is, so that we can filter that water and make it clean so they can go into the Everglades and not pollute that area again. Now, forgive me, what was your first question again? Stewart, that's right. I have no idea. I'm assuming that Stewart gets its water actually from pumps, but I don't know that for sure. But I honestly don't know what kind of water quality issues there are with the city of Stewart, so forgive me, I just can't answer that question. Yeah, more wells. Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have that answer. All right, Jack.
We've had a couple of people in our Zoom audience asking how they can see your documentary film. So, do you have anything you want to mention regarding that?
How do you see my documentary film? I have intentionally not put my documentary film on YouTube because we found that it was an excellent fundraiser, and we wanted to control the message, because when we show it, we wanted to be able to have panel discussions and like this, so that we can educate people more about the environmental issues that the film exposes. Zach and I were talking here just earlier today about the possibility that we might be able to do another showing of that. When I produced the film, in real money, it cost me about $10,000 out of my pocket, and when we did, calculated in all the volunteer hours, it was probably about a $50,000 project. That was all on my own money, and I never expected and never received and never wanted a single dime in return. In January 2020, just 2 weeks before the pandemic hit, we had our big premiere at the Lyric Theater. We raised over $20,000 that was split between Florida Oceanographic, WQCS, and the Elliott Museum. And it's a great fundraising tool. We'd love to be able to do that again. And it's very premature, but I know that we will have other showings of it in the future. Okay, any other questions? Yes, all the way in the back there.
So I know basically nothing about the native populations that lived here, like pre-settlers. And I'm wondering if in your research you found any kind of accounts or documentation about how Native Americans, were there settlements on the St. Lucie?
Absolutely. Yes, in the,
And John, could you repeat the question for the audience?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Were there any Native Americans living in this area? Were there any accounts of Native Americans living in the Treasure Coast area? Absolutely. The Ais Indians, A-I-S, the Ais Indians, were native to this area. They had an interesting strategy. During the winter months, they would migrate out to Hutchinson Island, and during the summer months, when they knew that hurricanes hit, they would come back onto the mainland. And they were a hunter-gatherer society. They were very successful. And we know about the Ais Indians because in the late 1600s, a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Dickinson got shipwrecked in this area, and he called them a bunch of cannibals. He got shipwrecked around where Hobe Sound, or Jonathan Dickinson National Park, or State Park is rather. We have our only written account that we have of the Ais Indians by his journal that he created, that became incidentally a huge bestseller after he was able to get released and get back into civilization. But yes, there were many, many Indian tribes in this area, and they all lived very sustainably and very successfully. Okay.
St. Lucie Beach one of the areas?
I'm sorry?
St. Lucie Beach, wasn't that one of the areas?
St. Lucie Beach, yeah, I believe that was one of the areas, yeah.
Lucie Beach.
Lucia, okay, yeah. Okay, question right here?
Is the water drained to the west coast to as much damage as the water that comes here?
The question was, the question was, what drains the west coast? The west coast of Florida is drained by the Caloosahatchee River. And the Caloosahatchee River actually, in many cases, gets way more water flows than we get here on the East Coast, which is unfortunate. You might be interested to know that in the late 1800s, the Caloosahatchee River was dredged to make public transportation available from Tampa down to Fort Myers, up the Caloosahatchee River, into Lake Okeechobee, and then north up the Kissimmee River to Lakeland. That's how they got to Lakeland. And it was a very, very successful, but yeah, you had to take steamboats that would do that route. It wasn't until later on then that, it was used for actual drainage as we know today. Okay, any other questions? Oh, yes, right here in the front.
I don't know if you covered this or not, but when did big sugar or the sugar agricultural, when did it all start? When did they start?
Right around the turn of the 1900s. There were experimental plantings in the late 1800s, but big sugar really took off, shortly after the 1900s. In the 1930s, I discovered in the 1930s, and again through my research, that because we have year-round growing season down around the the Everglades agricultural area, that the U.S. Farm Administration, which was going by a different name then, but they were offering people rides to the Everglades agricultural area during the Great Depression in order for them to be able to become agricultural farm workers. And for as little as $8 to $12, which was big money back then, but for $8 to $12, you could hop on a flatbed truck. They would take you down to the EAA, and you could work in the farm fields, sugar, vegetables, all kinds of cash crops like that, year-round. But it created such a horrible, horrible, impoverished environment that, again, the pictures that I have, that I was able to research, you couldn't believe that that was Florida, and yet it was. Belglade and Pahokee were the worst by far. And some of the first original color images by Kodacolor slides were taken in those areas, and by pure chance, I was able to get color images in the 1930s and the early 1940s of some of the camps, the workers' camps, and the living conditions they had there. It was just absolutely unbelievable. All right, yeah.
We'll take a question from one of our online viewers. John, in your opinion, what are the top 3 priorities related to pollution in the St. Lucie River right now? Is it septic? Is it agriculture? Is it runoff?
I think that septic would be my biggest area. of concern because so many of the septic tanks that are leaching into our water are along our coastal shorelines. And we're seeing massive kills of seagrass that our manatees depend on, and other species as well for spawning. And that's become an unbelievably critically important area of concern. When we have to hand feed romaine lettuce, to hundreds of manatees at a time to keep them from starving to death, that's a major problem. Okay, all the way in the back.
Do you have any idea why they're not starting to use that in reservoir as opposed to pumping water into the river?
As a matter of fact, I'm glad you asked that question. I have a very good answer to that. Many of you know that I'm the immediate past president of Audubon and Martin County, and we have Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, forgive me. Why is it that we're still pumping water down the St. Lucie River instead of storing it in reservoirs? Okay, they have just completed the C44 reservoir project. And Audubon and Martin County has, for the last 8 years, had a public access lease with the South Florida Water Management District, where we allow public participation for birding and for photography into some of their stormwater treatment areas. And the C44 project is a stormwater treatment area. That is going to be opened up to the public probably in October, November of this year, not quite sure when, but we are going to be, Audubon and Martin County is going to be allowing public access into that in a controlled fashion. They are starting to store water in that area, but they're just still putting the finishing touches on that. And between that storage area and then the construction of the new water storage area that is south of our canal, when those two are together, I'm not saying that it's going to create a complete termination of water flows, because I know that it won't, but it will drastically reduce them. But we're still a few years off before we're going to be, I don't want to say out of the woods yet, but at least we'll have a better handle on the problem. Yes, sir.
Is there a proposal to deal with the septic?
The question is there a proposal to deal with the septic? Yes, there is, and in fact, I just heard today, this evening, that Martin County was just awarded over $18 million for septic tank conversions. That is something that is very seriously being taken a look at, and funding is finally starting to flow, if you'll excuse the pun, for those kind of projects. They're very slow in coming. It's been estimated, I think the numbers is something in the neighborhood of 300,000 septic tank conversions that have to be done between here and Melbourne. But it's something that is on the radar of politicians, and they're taking a look at it. And more importantly, starting to fund it. Any other questions? Right here in the front.
Okay. I'm from New England, originally.
I'll forgive you. No, just kidding.
Why is it that everybody says, oh, it's going to take years, it's going to take years? The Connecticut River was where you couldn't even go near it, it was so polluted.
Mm-hmm.
3 years, and it was clean. Boston wanted to use it for drinking water.
Yeah. The question was, why is it supposed to take so many years to fix our problem when the Connecticut River was cleaned up in 3? And the answer to that is because our problems are far, far bigger than the Connecticut River. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres. We're talking about infrastructure that took 30 years to build, and we can't just take dynamite to it and blow it up, because that would cause even greater problems that we have right now. And part of the problem is political. I mean, I can't fight. I can't tell you any other way. It's political. It's funny, in my film, when you see the film, you'll see this part of the interview with Clyde Butcher. And he says, and Clyde's a pretty crusty guy. He'll just say it like it is. And I'm not going to say exactly what he said, but because, but Clyde Butcher said, the problem is that politicians just don't give a bleep, and that's his opinion. And quite frankly, a lot of politicians don't.
Never change.
And that's why letter writing and talking to your local politicians and putting the pressure on is so important. Because until they feel that pressure, they don't give a bleep. Yes?
They don't care. It's not that they don't understand it, they just don't even care.
Yeah,
It's not profitable for them to understand.
Yeah, the comment was, it's not that they don't understand it, it's just that they don't care. Because it really doesn't help them in any way. You know, and remember, we're all environmentalists here, and there's a lot of people that aren't. You know, and they get a lot of pressure from those other people as well.
That's why you vote them out.
That's why you vote them out, exactly. And by the way, I am not, you know, Martin County just got done voting out of existence 1,500 acres of natural wetlands and wildlife. You know, and I'm not here to say that I'm running for county commissioner, because I'm not, you know, but we need people in our county elected offices that understand our environment and are willing to fight for it.
And that's just the beginning. You're opening the door.
Yeah, and you're right. You know, opening the 1,500 acres is just the beginning. And I remember the quote, $20 million, 1,500 acres. That's how much 1,500 acres was worth to one county commissioner. We'll get $20 million in tax revenue. Isn't that wonderful? Whoopee. Okay.
And
anything?
If we don't have any other questions here in the audience, I think we got one more in the audience. I'll say
Okay, one more and then we have to close out. Yes, sir.
Does the seasonal discharge changes from Lake Okeechobee helping out, you know, within the last couple of years? Because I know what they discharging when the water was warmer, and now they start doing more in the winter months.
The question is, do the seasonal discharges in Lake Okeechobee, is the what's helping out?
Is it helping? You know?
Oh, the seasonal discharges down. Well, we haven't had a massive algae bloom like we had a few years back. So in one way you could say maybe it is helping, but then again we've had really cooperative weather as well. So it's really hard to quantify that, to be perfectly honest with you.
Also, this 120, in 2019, the city of Stewart had the best drinking water in the state of Florida.
The comment was that in 2019 the city of Stewart had the best drinking water in Florida. This is a refill of Stewart water, by the way. So, and by the way, in Central and South America, they don't use plastic bottles anymore. They use aluminum water bottles, which is a big step ahead. All right, I think that's it for right now.
I have one more from our Zoom audience to wrap up. I think it's a good thought question to wrap up our evening. I'm going to summarize a little bit. This is actually from a marine biologist who is joining us on Zoom tonight. And at some point during her career, she interviewed a bridge tender who worked in Fort Pierce, and that bridge tender told her that in the 1940s, he remembers the Indian River Lagoon being so clean it looked like the water in the Bahamas. And obviously things have changed a lot now. So her question for you, John, and I think for all of us really, is do you think we can find a way around this apparent lack of political will in the state of Florida? And that's a really great thought question to wrap up on.
How do we get around the political will? We vote them out. But the more importantly, and that's the simple question, the simple answer rather. The more important answer and the more, unfortunately, long-term answer is we get people to appreciate our environment. Until people understand just how special our environment is, they won't realize what actions we need to take to protect it. You know, again, I went to high school in East Africa. You know, I've seen some amazing things all over the world. You know, fortunately, most of the time on other people's dimes. But, you know, nothing compares to Florida. You know, and yeah, I lived in Washington State, and I backpacked in Idaho, and the mountains are great. But we have such an incredible, unique ecosystem in Florida. There's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. Trust me, I've been out there and I've seen it, and there's nothing like it here. And until we can convince our other fellow citizens of just how wonderful Florida is and our natural areas are, we don't have a snowball's chance in a very warm place of making any headway. So that mission starts with you guys. That's why I use photography as a teaching tool to be able to show people, you know, just how special Florida is. That's why I do the Audubon moment, so that every 60-second segment on public radio, which is aired several times a day, by the way, you know, I can teach people about how wonderful and unique the birds are. Just one small section of our environment, but the birds in your backyard are amazing. So it starts with you. You're the missionaries, if you will. You're the environmental missionaries to make sure that people understand just how wonderful Florida is. And with that, we have to say goodnight. Thank you so very, very much for being here.
Let's keep that applause going. That was a wonderful program, John. Thank you so much. Thank all of you guys. Have a wonderful Valentine's night. Just remember, we've got the Witheringtons coming next week. Blair and Dawn are just fascinating people. They've got a great story to tell. And remember that we are doing a book signing and a book sale starting at 6, and then the lecture will start at 6:30. So if you're interested in maybe grabbing one of the Witheringtons' books, or several of them, they're really cool books. I'm biased, but I think they have the best sea turtle book around if you want to learn about sea turtles. We'll see you back here at 6 a week from tonight. Thanks, everybody.